welcome to Heavy Storytelling. We're going to be reading a story, but first up we're going to be reading the Bible, and then we're going to be reading miracles, right?
I don't know. Maybe it's a miracle if we read.
So, I got my hair combed, but make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell and never miss another video. Hair tie, comment that down below.
Greetings, one and all. Hello, thank you for one person for joining us today. I know we're a little bit late getting started, but we are going to read a Christmas story, and I want to get it finished before Christmas. So, we have divided this book into 6 portions. There are 18 chapters. I divided that by 3. JJ came up with 6 equal, or at least the number of chapters are going to be equal. And we are going to couple that with...
22 remainder 2.
We are going to couple that with Psalm 119, which has 22 sections, one each for the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And we're going to divide that up into 6 sections as well. So, we're going to start off with 3 sections from Psalm 119. And I'm going to go ahead and begin. This is the English Standard Version. Psalm 119. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his testimonies, who seek him with their whole heart, who also do no wrong, but walk in his ways. You have commanded your precepts to be kept diligently. Oh, that my ways may be steadfast in keeping your statutes. Then I shall not be put to shame, having my eyes fixed on all your commandments. I will praise you with an upright heart. When I learn your righteous rules, I will keep your statutes. I do not utterly forsake me. Sorry, you do not utterly forsake me. All right, so that is... I forgot to explain, if you haven't ever read Psalm 119, it's like the most amazing psalm to me, because not only was every single, not only does that represent the Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, but every single verse begins with an Aleph. So if you were reading this in the Hebrew, then you would notice that right away. It's just like a poem that everything starts with the letter A. And so that's pretty cool. So they didn't do that in the English Standard Version. I think there are some translations that do try to keep the integrity of the poetry alive, but the English Standard Version, for whatever reason, didn't do it. But anyway, I'm going to continue with Beth now, which is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. With my whole heart I seek you. Let me not wander from your commandments. I have stored up your word in my heart, that I might not sin against you. Blessed are you, O Lord. Teach me your statutes. With my lips I declare all the rules of your mouth. In the way of your testimonies I delight, as much as in all riches. I will meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes. I will not forget your word. And the next section is Gimel, which is the 3rd letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Deal bountifully with your servant, that I may live and keep your word. Open my eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of your law. I am a sojourner on the earth. Hide not your commandments from me. My soul is consumed with longing for your rules at all times. You rebuke the insolent, accursed ones who wander from your commandments. Take away from me scorn and contempt, for I have kept your testimonies. Even though princes sit plotting against me, your servant will meditate on your statutes. Your testimonies are my delight. They are my counselors. And that is... we have come to the end of where we're going to be reading for today, but we'll pick up with verse 25 on the next time that we read, which is hopefully tomorrow. I do have a concert tomorrow night, which is very sadly not going to be broadcast on Facebook or any other social medium outlet. So unfortunately, no one will be able to watch it unless you are a military ID holder and have received the COVID vaccine. They're opening it up to the first 140 people to enter the auditorium, and there is no online venue. It doesn't make any sense to me either. JJ has a question. Let me find out what he has to say.
It's not a question. I have just something to say. You know the how can a young man keep his ways pure? Those 3 verses?
Mm-hmm.
I actually memorized those at Awanas.
Mm-hmm.
If you want, I can recite them for you.
Okay, go for it.
By the way, it's not the English Standard Version,
That's
so it
fine.
might be a little shifty. How can a young man keep his ways pure? By living according to your word. I search for you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commands. Yay!
That's super. That's really good. All right. So that is really cool. So JJ and Kimberly and Daniel, they are in Awanas, and they memorize a lot of scripture, and they're learning a lot and getting a lot. And he mentioned that the book that he has isn't English Standard Version. I generally use English Standard Version just because I think it's easy to read. Some people don't like it as much, and that's okay, because I'm not particular as to which translation, as long as it is an accurate representation of the original Hebrew and Greek versions, which I think that the English Standard Version is a fairly good approximation of them. So, more on translations later at a different time, but right now let's go ahead and we're going to begin this book. This is a new book that, for us, that actually I think that I read this back when I was reading in Colleen. It's called Miracle on 34th Street by Valentine Davies. And there's a very good movie that's based on this book. And actually, if I remember right, they're actually very similar. So if you've watched the movie, you're probably not going to have any curveballs. All right, so we're going to go ahead and begin with chapter 1. And I recommend the old movie, not the new one, but the new one's okay too. All right, chapter 1. If you searched every old folks' home in the country, you couldn't find anyone who looked more like Santa Claus. He was the living, breathing incarnation of the old gent, white beard, pink cheeks, fat tummy and all. And his name was Kris Kringle, too. Whether this was coincidence or design, a sort of stage name he had assumed, his friends at the Maplewood Home for the Aged never knew. Nor did they know exactly how old he was. His white whiskers made him look a good 75, and yet when he laughed or walked, you would swear he wasn't a day over 50. His eyes were quick and happy, and he had a smile to match. Not only did Kris look precisely like Santa Claus, he firmly believed he was that jolly old gentleman. Dr. Pierce, the physician at Maplewood, found this delusion innocent and harmless. In fact, the old man's kindly shrewdness in all other respects had won the doctor completely. He was devoted to Kris, and was his staunchest defender. He often came to visit his little room at Maplewood. It was littered with toys of all sizes and shapes, half-finished models and catalogs. Kris spent most of his time there, smoking his pipe and whittling at toys. One November morning, when Dr. Pierce dropped in, Kris hardly noticed him. He was reading a newspaper advertisement, and his eyes snapped with indignation as he read. A shopping service offered to make all purchases of Christmas gifts well in advance of the holiday and save the subscriber 10% in the bargain. All you have to do is send us the names and ages of all the people you wish to remember, Kris read aloud. We will relieve you of the irksome necessity of Christmas shopping. Angrily, Kris threw the paper on the floor. Is this what Christmas has degenerated into, Doctor? He asked. It's pure commercialism. Is there no true Christmas spirit left in the world? Dr. Pierce was afraid not. Christmas had certainly become commercialized. It had become big business, and the spirit behind it seemed to be lost in the milling crowds that packed all the stores. Chris was not prepared to believe that, in spite of outward appearances and ads like this. "No, Doctor," he said, "underneath all the hurry and bustle, people still believe in Santa Claus and all Christmas stands for." He suddenly smiled at the doctor and asked him what he wanted for Christmas. "I'll tell you what I want," said Pierce, half to himself. "An X-ray machine. We've needed one here for years." "You shall have it," Chris said. The doctor smiled. "If I get an X-ray machine, I'll know you're Santa Claus." "You just wait, Doctor, you'll see." Chris picked up a toy and started to whittle away on it, cheerfully pulling at his pipe. But Dr. Pierce was worried. A frown settled over his pleasant face as he watched Chris working. There was something on his mind, and he groped for the right words. Finally, he forced himself to come right out with it. "Chris, you'll have to leave Maplewood." "Why?" asked Chris in astonishment. "Well," the doctor explained, "he had been fighting the board on this for years, but they had finally overruled him and issued a definitive order. In fact, there was nothing more Pierce could do." Kringle still didn't understand. "Well, Chris, the laws of the state and Maplewood's charter only allow us to keep old people so long as they are in good physical and mental health." "What's the matter with me?" asked Chris. "You've told me I'm in better physical shape than 90% of your patients, and mentally, well, I've passed all your tests with flying colors. Look, I still remember the last one." Chris proceeded to go through the routine of a simple mental test, adding and subtracting, giving synonyms for words, and so forth. There was no doubt about it. He knew all the answers. Mr. Kringle, in spite of his age, was keen, alert, and exceptionally skillful. "I know," said the doctor quietly, "but it's this Kris Kringle business, you know. We've discussed it before." "You mean because I'm Santa Claus?" The doctor nodded slowly. "But there's nothing wrong about that," said Chris. "It happens to be the truth." "It's not quite that simple," Pierce replied. "Unfortunately, the board does not believe in Santa Claus, Chris. So technically, you're, well, not acceptable." "So I'm not sane because the board of directors doesn't believe in Santa Claus." "That's one way of putting it," admitted Dr. Pierce. Chris paused and reflected for a moment. "What happens next?" he asked. Pierce explained that Maplewood had an arrangement with the Mount Hope Sanatorium. "The Nut House?" Chris exploded. "Never!" "But what's your alternative?" Pierce asked him. "Have you got any money?" Chris examined a small checkbook which lay on his desk. He had $34.86. "Chris, you're pretty old," said Dr. Pierce. "It won't be easy to earn a living. And if you're unsuccessful, you will become a ward of the state. And if you're picked up because you tell somebody you're Santa Claus, you'll be sent to Mount Hope anyway, so why not go direct?" But Chris was adamant. There was nothing wrong with him, and he'd be darned if he was going to an asylum. Sorry, wow, it has a bad word. Dr. Pierce finally conceded that it was really up to Chris. If he left Maplewood, nobody would bother him. That would end the case as far as as they were concerned. But what would Chris do? How could he fend for himself? He didn't have much money. Where would he stay? "The zookeeper in Central Park is a friend of mine. I'll stay with him," Chris answered. Dr. Pierce urged him to reconsider and accept the transfer philosophically. "You'll have time to think it over. We'll talk about it again," he said as he moved toward the door. For a dozen years, and he couldn't get near them, Chris nodded silently, but there was a look of determination on the old man's face. The moment the doctor had gone, he hauled out a large suitcase from his closet and briskly began to pack. Chapter 2. Sorry about that, I turned 2 pages. The Central Park Zoo was nearly deserted at this early hour. In one of the enclosures, a keeper was tidying up in anticipation of a busy day. As the white-bearded figure approached, the keeper greeted him eagerly with a wave of his shovel. "How are you, Chris?" he called. "Fine, Jim, never better," said the old man heartily. "And how are the boys?" "Getting fat and lazy," Jim told him, smiling. "And it's mostly your fault." Chris laughed and gave a whistle. From within the shed, a reindeer's head peered shyly out, then another. The old man called again and held out a handful of carrots. In a few minutes, half a dozen reindeer were eating out of his hand. Jim stood silently by and watched this performance, smiling. Chris sure had an uncanny way with animals. Jim had fed and fussed over these critters for a dozen years, and he couldn't get near them. But even the timid would eat right out of Chris's hand. Even the timid does would eat right out of Chris's hand. Jim had never ceased to be amazed at this. It was a bond between him and Chris. "Jim, I may need a place to stay. Could you put me up for a while?" asked Chris. "Why, certainly, Chris, as long as you want. There's plenty of room," Jim assured him. Fully satisfied that all was well, Chris started on his way again. Swinging along with his exuberant, youthful gait, he had no special destination, but he loved being outdoors in the crisp, cold air. If only there were snow on the ground, he thought, this would be a perfect day. As the old gentleman approached the western limits of the park, he suddenly stopped and cocked his head to one side, listening. His keen ears had picked up an exciting sound. It was faint but unmistakable. Somewhere in the distance, a band was playing Jingle Bells. It seemed to be coming from just outside the park. Chris turned and made for the nearest exit. Central Park West, and especially the side streets leading into it, were filled with color and confusion as Chris arrived upon the scene. For the Macy Parade was about to start amid indescribable excitement. Sponsored annually by the R.H. Macy department store, it was every child's dream of a Christmas parade, or as near as mere adults could make it. A sharp wind was blowing the huge, inflated figures every which way. A Pilgrim Father, Jack the Giant Killer, a panda, and an enormous ice cream cone careened crazily about, towering 2 or 3 stories into the air. The costumed men who held the guide ropes seemed like frantic Lilliputians. Sleepy, Grumpy, Dopey, and the other dwarfs scampered about and climbed aboard their floats. So did the myriad of famous characters. A dozen bands in fancy uniforms were loudly tuning up. The person who seemed to be in charge of the whole business was a handsome, well-dressed, business-like young woman. She was checking off various people on the list. Chris heard them address her as Mrs. Walker. Assisting her was a spectacled, bald-headed, and very much harried gentleman named Mr. Shellhammer. The thing that really fascinated Chris was the last float in the parade. Santa Claus in his sleigh, pulled by 8 wooden but very realistic reindeer. The Santa Claus was practicing with his whip in a wild and lurching manner as Chris sauntered up. Chris stood watching as long as he could. Then he stepped up with a polite "Allow me, sir," took the whip from his hand. With a single expert flip of the wrist, he flicked the long whip. The end cracked smartly 1 inch over the farthest reindeer's ear. "You see, it's all in the wrist," he said, but Macy's Santa wasn't impressed. One whiff of his breath told Chris the reason. The man grabbed for a pint bottle not too well hidden beneath his blanket, taking more and more frequent nips. Chris was shocked and horrified. The idea of a drunk depicting Santa Claus to thousands of impressionable children infuriated him. He started toward Mrs. Walker to register an outraged protest, but the young lady was suddenly standing next to him, beckoning for the float to move ahead. Before Chris could speak, it suddenly lurched forward, and the saturated Santa nearly toppled off the float. It didn't take Mrs. Walker long to size up the situation. This man was really drunk, and she was responsible for all the personnel. She fired him on the spot. "Just think if Mr. Macy had seen him," said Mr. Shellhammer in a horrified tone. "Just think if Mr. Gimel had seen him," said Mrs. Walker in an even greater horror. Now the whole parade was ready to start, and they had no Santa Claus. Mrs. Walker and Shellhammer saw Chris at the same time. They pounced upon him together. "Would you be Santa?" she asked him. "Have you any experience?" Mr. Shellhammer inquired. This last question struck the old man's funny bone. His little round body shook with inward chuckles. "Yes," he said, "a little." "Then you've got to help us out, please." "Madam," Chris replied with quiet dignity, "I am not in the habit of substituting for spurious Santa Clauses." Mrs. Walker pleaded and coaxed, but the old man was firm. Not even money seemed to interest him. "Well, we can't hold the parade up any longer," said Mr. Shellhammer. "We'll have to go without a Santa Claus." Chris looked off toward the crowd of excited children lining the streets, and then he realized that he had no alternative. He couldn't disappoint those eager faces. "All right," he said, handing his hat and cane to Shellhammer. "Get me the clothes, I'll do it." A few minutes later, Chris found himself the leading figure of this parade, this great parade, moving down the long avenue, waving and smiling at thousands of children, cracking his whip and having the time of his life. Chapter 3. When she had finally managed to get the parade underway, Doris Walker, exhausted and frozen, returned to her apartment on Central Park West. The parade was passing right by the building, but Doris pushed through the crowd and entered without giving it so much as a glance. She didn't care if she never saw a parade again. All she wanted was a hot bath. Doris opened the door to her small and sternly modest apartment and called, "Susan! Susan!" But there was no reply. Cleo, the colored maid, poked her head out of the kitchen and said that Susan was in Uncle Fred's apartment watching the parade. Doris walked to the living room window and looked out. From her inside apartment, the only view was directly into the rear windows of the front apartment across the street. Doris rapped loudly on the glass, and in a moment Fred appeared at the opposite window. They waved a greeting, and Doris shouted that she'd be over in a little while. Uncle Fred was no relation of Susan's at all. Young and attractive, Fred Gailey was a lawyer with one of the city's oldest law firms. Being neighbors, he and Susan had become great pals, and out of this had grown a pleasant and casual friendship between Fred and Doris. It was far more casual than Fred would have liked, but Doris's first marriage had ended in divorce, and from her grim avoidance of any reference to it, Fred gathered that it had been a bitter disillusionment. At any rate, she seemed determined to avoid further entanglement. She was pleased and friendly enough to Fred, but the real Doris would never emerge from her shell, not even for a fleeting moment. Fred's apartment faced Central Park West, and from its windows he and Susan, a rather serious child of 6, had a perfect view of the gay and colorful parade. The sound of band music and cheering children filled the air, but, as usual, Fred was filled with much more childlike wonder and excitement than his little companion. As one of the huge inflated figures passed the window, Fred said eagerly, "That's Jack the Giant Killer, isn't it? And look, the great big fellow is the giant." "Of course," said little Susan, "there are no giants, really." "Maybe for now, Susan, but in the olden days—" Susan shook her head firmly. "People sometimes grow very tall, but that is abnormal, my mother told me." Fred studied the child for a moment as she unexcitedly watched the parade. He couldn't help but feel sorry for her. True, she was intelligent, maybe too much so for a child of her age, but there was no gaiety about her. Fun was a stranger to Susan. "Maybe your mother's right," said Fred meekly, "but I believe in giants anyhow." When Doris arrived, she launched into a caustic and detailed account of all her troubles with the soused Santa. Fred tried to quiet her with gestures and grimaces, but it was no use. Finally, using a cup of coffee as a pretext, he dragged Doris into his tiny kitchenette and begged her not to expose all these disillusioning facts to her daughter. But Doris had very definite ideas about bringing up children. She believed in utter realism and truth. Susan was certainly not going to be led to believe a lot of myths and legends, like Santa Claus, for example. "Why not?" asked Fred. "What harm does it do? They grow up considering life as a big fairy tale instead of reality. Doris answered. Subconsciously, they keep waiting for Prince Charming to come along, and when he does, he turns out to be... Look, Doris. Fred's voice was kindly. You had a tough break, I'm not denying that. You loved someone deeply, you trusted him, and then one day you suddenly woke up and found how wrong you'd been. But all men aren't like that, and I don't think Susan's going to be any happier growing up to think so. Doris turned away. Fred's directness had found its target. I'm sorry, he went on, but I'm right, Doris. He moved closer to her. And I only wish you'd give me a chance to prove that I'm really the sort of person that, well, you hoped he was. I've burnt my fingers once, Doris answered quietly. She turned back toward the living room, and Fred, with a hopeless shrug, followed. That's the end of chapter 3, and that is where we will conclude today. I hope you're enjoying the story, A Miracle on 34th Street by Valentine Davies, and we will continue hopefully tomorrow. As I previously mentioned, the complications with the schedule, but I should be home by about 8 or 8:30. Otherwise, we'll try to finish or continue on Saturday. Hope you're enjoying this reading, and God bless you. Have a great night. Thank you.